Okay.
All right, there you are. So
Did you hear it?
now that we are
Okay.
recording, try not to get too weird or make sure you're unmuted with all sorts of randomness because it is captured in time right now. I am geeked to get a chance to connect with you all, and you will probably, speaking of children, you heard me talking about my toddler eating dog food and rocks, you will probably hear them bursting through because they are likely to get home from school very soon and they are very loud. So we're going to do our best to not get distracted by them. But what I am really, really passionate about, if you haven't heard me talk before, is how do we help people be at their best so they can give their best? And in particular, my mission is to help not only educators, but school leaders, parents, everyone understand burnout and resilience. So, how do we get less burnout? How do we get more resilience, more satisfaction with our work? So, it's just a quick aside to kind of set the context of where we are at. Let's just look at what is burnout. How does burnout happen? So, there are three major dimensions of how people burn out, and this is true of all professions, not just educators, but definitely educators fall within here. The major three things that comprise burnout are number one, exhaustion, stress, being overloaded with our work, not having the autonomy to deal with our work. Number two is cynicism, where we feel this disconnect, this distrust. We protect ourselves. We create those emotional boundaries because we've been burned before. And then there's inefficacy. I don't have the skill set or the belief in my skill set to rise to the occasion. Now, I could talk a whole day about these things, but I'm bringing this to our attention because the number one starting point for burnout is this category right here, exhaustion. In almost every case where someone burns out or struggles within their work, it starts because they're overloaded. They have too much work and not enough time or resources or skills. And what we know is that people who say that they are highly exhausted, like they feel exhaustion daily, are 2.2 times as likely to burn out and leave their work. So, with that context, we're going to be looking at how do we eliminate some of this exhaustion? How do we reduce workloads or be more efficient within our workloads to ensure that we really are at our best with this work? Now, with that in mind, here's what I'm curious to know to kind of understand more of how I can support you all. If you could in the chat, just jot down what is your main work role. So if you're a teacher, what level you teach, where do you teach? If you are administrator, what level of administration or what school do you work in? Or if you're support, whatever that might be. Now, Linda, no pressure. You're driving, or if anyone else is driving, no worries about texting and driving. But for those who are by their computers, if you could just jot down Angie, principal pre-K through 6. Sarah, instructional coach for regional office. Linda's driving, but she's my partner and does the same. Okay, thank you for being the spokesperson for Linda on her behalf. If anyone else can jot in, post in, let me know. High school business teacher. I believe that's Tanya. Kindergarten, the little monsters. Tanya's got the big monsters. Amy's got the little demons, little monsters. All right, so this is helpful for me to know because if you're a teacher, we're going to be talking through lens a lot of educators. If you're a coach, if you're an administrator, we're also going to be talking through those lens. But in particular, if anyone's in a leadership or support role, this is really important to understand how workload and managing that workload can be effective. So we're talking about time management, but really we're talking about managing time to be more efficient with that time, to free up time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick little aside of how are teachers' workloads right now? What is their overall time commitment? How does that impact their work? And then how do we free up some of that time? So first thing, how many hours on average, or at least the median, do educators work? We have data on that. What we know is that the median amount of time that an educator works is 54 hours a week. So much beyond the 40-hour work week. And I'm not the greatest mathlete, but that equates to about 2 extra hours a day, even including into our weekends, that on the median educators are working, meaning some work more, some work less, but line them all up, smack dab in the middle, 54 hours per week. So if anyone says teachers aren't working hard enough because they get summers, breaks off, those people are crazy. They don't understand. Now, let's look at what happens if we free up some of that time and manage some of that time. What we know is that educators who cite that they are very unlikely or less likely to leave their job work a median of 52 hours. So even just saving up a couple hours can shift people from super burned out to, you know what, I think I can maintain, I can do this. On the flip side, just adding a few hours to that median puts people in the category of very likely to leave their work. So 57 hours, the median, people are like, I can't do this anymore. This is unsustainable. So what we're going to be looking at is how do we get at least to that 52-hour mark, hopefully less, because we know that makes an impact on our overall work. Now, ultimately, here's what I want for you. I want you to work less. I want you to give yourself permission to not put in all the time, all the energy, all the strain and drain to the work that you do. And here's why that is. A lot of times as educators, we have a hard time just being done with our work and putting a pause on it and not worrying about adding on the extra thing. But I want to give you a little bit of research, some data to support why you should work smarter, not harder, why you should reduce those hours. So here's a little bit of nerdy tidbit. The United Kingdom, a few years ago, authorized a massive longitudinal study. And the entire point of the study was to test out how do we reduce educators' workloads. Like, let's take a moment to appreciate that a government function wanted to reduce teachers' workloads. I wonder what that would be like. Anyway, so what they did is they set up these controlled studies. They looked at all these schools, thousands of educators, tens of thousands of students, and they wanted to do some comparisons. So they would let teachers in groups start to identify how can we cut down on our workload. And then they helped them design an actual study to collect data, to test a hypothesis, compare it to others. These were some of the practices that educators sought out to reduce. They tested out things like literally just grading less. Like, I'm not going to grade all the things. I'm going to grade way less of the things. Or I'm going to do peer grading. Kids are going to grade each other or give each other some feedback. Or I'm just going to use whole class verbal feedback. Or I'm not going to worry about collecting data every week or having these weekly, even bi-weekly data meetings. I'm not going to require or be required to submit lesson plans to my administrator. Now, they tested all of these things. And here's idea number one. What they found is that teachers, on average, reduced their work hours from an hour and 20 minutes every day down to 30 minutes a day, meaning they cut their workload beyond half of what they're putting in on their work days. Imagine what you would do with almost an entire hour more of your day. It's a beautiful thing. Daydream about it for a minute, because let's look at how did that impact the teachers first. What they found is that not only did it reduce workaholism, like people feeling like they were so connected to their job that they couldn't detach from it, but it increased the educators' well-being. It increased their efficacy, which is a major component of burnout. It increased their optimism, their love of learning, and their enthusiasm. Sounds cute, but now we have to ask, did that do anything for students? Like, it'd be great to work less, but if my kids are suffering and struggling, I'm probably not going to get permission or approval to do this. Here's the most important thing. When they looked at actual test scores, data, benchmarks, what they found is, at worst, there was no impact on student learning, meaning working less didn't impair the learning. It was equivalent to working more than they had previously. But at best, what they found is that in most of the groups that they studied, there was a positive effect on student performance, meaning working less made teachers more efficient, which impacted their student learning. Because students had benefits of things like more direct feedback, more immediate feedback. They had the opportunity to interact with their peers. Teachers had more time to actually teach rather than sifting through data, spending their time with lesson planning. So if you need permission, here's your permission. Working less, working smarter, not harder, and more efficiently with your time can be a positive impact on student learning. With that, we're going to take a little aside now to looking at a concept. So where we're going to go with the rest of our time is we're going to introduce a concept that some of us are familiar with. We're going to revisit a little bit, and then we are going to strategize. I'm going to give you a couple resources to help you start to plot out, how can I work smarter, not harder? How do I design my ideal work week? And how do I make sure that I don't get overloaded by unexpected challenges and changes? So now let's turn to what is called the Eisenhower approach to time management. You may have heard this quotation before: what is urgent is seldom important, and what is important is seldom urgent. Dwight Eisenhower spoke this, and of course, a bunch of nerdy motivating people decided, hey, let's turn this into an actual strategy. So, what has been developed for many a decade is what is called the Eisenhower matrix. If you're familiar with it, we're just going to do some connection of how have you used this? How can you relate? If you're unfamiliar with it, feel free to start thinking about how does this apply to your world? And we'll also even talk about, was this something that we could use with our students as well? So essentially the quadrants are this. We have what is important and urgent would be quadrant 1. And this is where we go into scramble rat race mode. So this is where I have the deadline and it is coming up and I have to get that deadline done. Like grades have to be posted tonight. Conferences are tonight. I need to make sure my lesson is ready because my students are coming in 5 minutes. This is the stuff that is critical to our work, but it has to happen now. Sometimes we live our day-to-day life in this quadrant, constantly just jumping from thing to thing to thing. Now, I will say this is the quadrant where people most start to feel some exhaustion, is that they're just constantly jumping from urgent to urgent to urgent. The next quadrant is things that are not urgent, but they are important, meaning they're coming up on the horizon. I do have to give my students feedback on their work sometime. I do have conferences coming up on the horizon. I do have to evaluate my teachers by the end of the month. So it's coming, it's important, but it's not in crisis mode yet. Our third quadrant is it's urgent, it feels like it, but it's really not that important. So sometimes we create this sense of urgency around things that really aren't that important. So yeah, I do need to clean my room, but like it's not super important. And yet I might go into this mode of if I don't clean my classroom by tomorrow, the lesson is entirely ruined. So sometimes these things start to creep up. Sometimes other people's stress dumps onto us and we feel like, oh no, I have to help someone else manage their crisis right now because I'm a caring person, I have empathy, when even though it's urgent, it's in your face right now, it doesn't mean it's important to your work, your satisfaction, and what you do. The fourth quadrant is the not urgent, not important. So my favorite example of this is the social media scroll that turns into a social media hour where you're like, I'm just gonna, take a little break. I'm gonna hop on Facebook, see what's happening right now. What's going on Instagram? And then 30 minutes later, we're just jumping from social media to social media. It's not important. It's not urgent to our work. Now, that being said, if I manage my time appropriately, I should feel free to just live in here and be all right doing things that aren't urgent, aren't important. Like that is okay, so long as it's not creating more of these crises. So big concept, one of the most important things that we're going to be looking at and doing some planning around is how do we prioritize quadrant number 2? If you can master quadrant number 2, you prevent important things from shifting into quadrant 1, because if I don't get that stuff done ahead of time, it's still important. It's going to start to come into crisis mode. We'll also look at how to reduce and delegate and how do we eliminate these things. So here's where we're going to take a little pause for me talking, because I can talk all day long. In the chat, here's what I'd love for you to jot down. In which quadrant do you spend most of your time in your role? So as an educator, in which quadrant do you spend most of your time? And feel free if you want to elaborate a little bit on that too, of like, man, I would love to be in quadrant 2, but I'm just putting out fires left and right. Or maybe you're like, I'm going to own it right now. I just like do stuff that has no importance and I get so off track all the time, just chatting it up with colleagues, that maybe I'm more in a little bit quadrant 4, quadrant 3. Jot down some thoughts. I'll give you a minute to process. In which quadrant do you spend most of your time? And if you want to elaborate, we'd love to hear more. Looks like we got a couple ones coming up. All right, a few more seconds to jot some thoughts down. All right, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Now, just from our small sample size, quadrant one seems to be definitely the quadrant a lot of us are in, and that is consistent with pretty much every educator I've ever worked with, spoken to, and thinking about my own experiences as a teacher. Now, honestly, what often happens a lot of times is we get so overloaded in quadrant one that we try to escape to quadrant four. It's like, how do I get my mind off of it? And then it creates this vicious cycle of like, oh no, I didn't do the thing. So let's look a little bit at within each quadrant, what is one strategy or concept that can help us a little bit more. Let's start with our good old friend, quadrant one. There is a Mark Twain quote, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit here, but he had this quote that if the first thing you do every morning is eat a frog, nothing else is going to bother you that day. And the equation of this is that sometimes we have these like really urgent things we have to do, but they're not pleasant. They're not fun. And so what we do is we just keep putting them off and putting them off and putting them off, building the urgency rather than just doing the thing so we can move on to others. For example, cannot tell you how many times I knew I had to call a parent back and I knew it was going to be an unpleasant conversation, but I would find so many excuses not to do that thing. If you're an administrator, the idea of like, man, I really don't want to observe this teacher and give feedback because it's going to be a really hard conversation. Those are things that sometimes, because there's anticipated stress, we shove aside and it's just lingering in the corner of the room, adding to our stress levels. So as we look at how we're going to start to plot out and plan our days, my strongest recommendation is that if you have something that is urgent and important, try to make it the first thing you do in a day, because the further the day goes, the more exhausted we get, the more distractions can pile on our plate. So how do we tackle those things straight away? Principle number one, eat the frog. As we move into quadrant number two, the most important thing that we're going to be looking at is creating dedicated time blocks. So we are going to look at how do we block out that time? How do we protect that time? How do we ensure that those moments are reserved for us to get things done ahead of time? That's going to be a major talking point soon. The third quadrant, this is where like we have to just be honest with ourselves and we have to know when are the moments where we start to fall into the shiny things, the distractions that seem really important, but they're not. Example for me, anytime I would even have like subconscious stress, I would find myself wanting to clean my classroom. I'd be like moving around, trying to shift some things and like, oh no, my whiteboard looks disgusting. And so I would do that thinking it was really urgent, when it really didn't matter in the long run. So I learned the power of delegating to these things. So for example, what would often happen is I would have students who they would be the ones to tell me like, Mr. Mielke, your whiteboard is disgusting. I can't even learn. And so I'd say, hey, what are you doing after school today? Do you want to help me clean my room? And these type A kids would be like, yes, I would love to help clean your room. So learning how to delegate that out. Another example, oftentimes people come to us in a crisis that isn't really a crisis. Like, okay, it's important to them, but it isn't really necessarily our job or our space to try to mend that. My world as an educator seemed to be teenagers coming to me in crisis. They'd be like, oh, my breakup, I can't believe they broke up with me, like melting down. And it's like, it's important, not my job though. So what I learned to do is to know where those boundaries are and say things like, hey, I would love to help support you with this. Here's what that support's going to look like. I'm going to write you a pass to go up to the front office to check in with a counselor, or we have these peer listeners we've trained. I'm going to give you a couple recommendations of them. Chat with them first, and then later on today, I'm going to have more time so you can come back and we can check in then. So there's this moment of, I see this crisis coming my way. It's not important. How do I delegate that out? Some of us have a hard time giving up control, but sometimes giving up control over the shiny things is how we find control over the important things. So be thinking about how can you delegate and resist that. Fourth sub-strategy is see the hurdle, jump the hurdle. So again, this is a self-awareness piece. What are the things that are distracting me and how do I prevent those in advance? Here's some examples for me. I noticed that even if I had the tab open on my computer with my email, or even if I had my phone nearby me, I would get distracted checking my email over and over again. So I'd be sitting there trying to plan out lessons, and then I'd get kind of stressed out. And so then I'd jump over to email, and that moment completely stole me away from focusing in. So I learned to literally just close out that tab so I can't even see emails coming in my inbox. I learned to set my phone all the way across the room on silent while I was doing another task. Or I learned that sometimes during my planning, certain people would drop in and they would just want to shoot the breeze, which fun, but not effective for helping me be productive. So I learned literally to turn off my lights in my room, lock my door during my planning, and go to the corner where no one can visibly see me. And by knowing those distractions ahead of time, see the hurdle, I knew how to jump over those hurdles and block out those moments. So we're gonna do another little moment of processing here. Be thinking about how could you apply these concepts, or how do you have some new ideas coming into mind of, okay, here's what I need to prioritize. For this one, we're gonna do a little bit of reflection time. I'm gonna put a couple minutes on the clock here. What is one way you can see yourself using this concept to manage your time differently? Open-ended question, gave you quite a few examples. Feel free to bring up your own. What is one way you can use this concept to manage your own time a little differently? About 30 more seconds to process some thoughts. All right, let's check on in. Now, couple notes, a couple that people identified is really kind of looking at that quadrant 4, like what are the distractions that are going to get in the way. So as we start to plan out in our next phase, kind of keep those in mind, because we're going to be looking at, if we could design our ideal week, what would it look like? And then we're going to get realistic. So what are the things that are going to get in the way, and how do we block those? Before we go there, though, I want to turn your attention into the chat. I shared a PDF resource, hopefully you can pull it open, of how I've develop this Eisenhower planner into literally a planner that someone can use to jot down ideas. And it's framed in a way that teachers could use it with students, or a coach could use it with an educator, just kind of different prompts or different ways of introducing the Eisenhower planner. So resource there for you to consult, to peruse, think about how you could identify it. Here's what we're going to turn to next. Now, I'm going to talk for the most part in this next phase around kind of the teacher lens, because a lot of us are in support of teachers, or we are teachers, and we're going to look at some of the big time sucks. So what are the pieces that most shift into quadrant 1, or where do we spend most of our time? Here's an interesting fact. If you remember earlier, on the median, 54 hours a week is what a teacher works. What's interesting is that the median hour of actual instructional time is only 25 hours, meaning more hours are beyond instruction than they are for the instruction of students themselves. And from there, we can look at where are the biggest time sucks. So what are the things that teachers are spending a whole lot of time doing, and how can we cut those down? These are the big 4 for the average teacher. grading or feedback or assessment, or in some way looking at student work and learning and trying to evaluate it or provide feedback. Lesson planning, so knowing what I'm going to teach, finding the materials and resources, making sure everything's aligned is one of the second big time sucks. Data monitoring, or kind of including that with grading. So the moments of where I'm starting to develop and look through my data and my tests and try to identify trends. I might be having data meetings to talk about what I'm going to do differently. And then the other category of communication, emails, parent emails, staff emails, random emails popping into my inbox. These are the four big time sucks. And so what we're going to look at next is how can we plot out far more efficient way of reducing these things. For example, around 5 hours a week or more, the median is lesson planning. So can we be more efficient with lesson planning? I know as an English teacher, former English teacher, so much of my energy was into grading and evaluating student essays. So how do we reduce that as well? But I'm going to give you a new resource. First, I'm going to show you the resource. I'm going to share the resource with you so we can look at how do we design our management and our time a little differently. So coming your way in a moment is going to be this document. I'm going to share it with you via Google. I'm also going to share it with you via a PDF. And what it's going to entail is looking at, number one, how do we plot out our ideal work week? So we're going to set the goal and try to develop some control. And then we're going to try to strategically use a quadrant 2 to place these critical tasks, plan them out ahead so they don't become quadrant 1. So where it'll start. In a moment, you're going to identify how many total hours of work do you want to do in a given week. So even if you don't know exactly how many hours you work right now, try to plan out for yourself, like, okay, I would love it if I only put in an extra hour a day beyond my contracted time. Or maybe I'm gonna be realistic, maybe it's gonna be 2 hours, but that's how I want it to look. So we'll start, how many total hours do we want to work? And then we're going to backtrack it and break it down. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna just subtract out how many total hours do I have no control over. So this would be, for example, instructional time. Like I would love to just escape my classroom and not have to do it, but I have to. Or if I know as an administrator, I have to do evaluations, or I know that every week we have a leadership team meeting at a certain time, like I'm gonna include those. If I don't go to those, I'm literally fired. So we're gonna subtract those out. Then we're gonna look at the flexible. So where are the areas where I have a little bit more control, like my planning period, or once students are released from school, or before students are coming into school. And this is the chunk that we're most going to kind of control. So step one, in a moment, I'm going to set you loose to identify how many hours do you want to work, how many can you not control, subtract those out, and then how many do you have control over. Step two, then you're going to start to identify within these targeted blocks. Now, again, I looked at what were some of the prime time sucks of the average educator. And so what is your hope? Like, let's say I want to spend 2 hours of grading a week, or 3 hours of looking at feedback and giving student feedback a week, or, maybe a couple hours of looking through my data. How many hours a week of those that you control do you want to dedicate towards communication? So I wrote parent communication, but this could also be responding to staff emails. If you have to complete forms, maybe you have to do IEPs or 504s. How many of those remaining hours do I want to dedicate to other emails or forms? Maybe I include those, maybe I separate them. How many of those hours do I want to dedicate to lesson planning? So again, we're going to try to set our ideal for a moment to start to plot out ahead of time what our schedule is going to look like. Final step. This is where, again, we're going to theorize. It's going to be a little pre-test. We're going to test it out. Once I know how many hours I want to work in each of those categories, I'm going to anticipate and start to plan out when those moments are going to happen this upcoming week, or maybe next week. So how much time do I have before school? Maybe I only have 30 minutes typically when I get to school, before my students come in or before staff start to come in. Within those 30 minutes, is there a chunk of that time I can dedicate towards one of those things? And then we're going to scroll down a little bit and we're going to start to look at during school. So this would be like my planning period. Or if I do have some blocks that aren't dedicated to a meeting or a committee, what am I going to do during those times? After school, let's say I'm going to set a goal that I'm only going to spend an extra hour in the building after school. What do I want that hour to look like? And then lastly, this is an option if you want to spend any time over your evening. Now, for some people, straight up, they don't. They're like, I don't want to spend any of my evening time. My goal is to make sure I fill these blocks so that I don't have anything remaining that I have to put into my evening. For others, maybe some people are like, you know what? I'm going to be realistic. I would much rather get home to my family, and maybe before bed, I've got 30 minutes or so. That's when I'm going to dedicate some time. You choose for you. One last little detail, and then I'm going to set us loose for some processing, is as you start to jot down some of these, try to look at being aware of your hurdles, your struggles, your challenges. So here's an example of that. Maybe you're like, man, I want to try to crank out some grading first thing in the morning, but you know realistically that your brain might be scrambling to do lesson planning. Like maybe you know for sure that you're going to be trying to put together some last minute resources. So maybe you look, okay, I'm going to make sure that during this time, I always reserve 30 minutes for some last minute lesson planning tune up. Or maybe you think in advance, you're like, hey, if I know that my mornings, I'm always scrambling for lesson plans, I'm going to block out that time after school. So I know for Tuesday, I'm going to make sure that I dedicate 30 minutes of my time to planning my lessons, getting my prompts set up for my students before they come in, making sure my links are working within my documents, so I'm ready to go. I've talked for a while. Here's where we're going to go next. I'm going to give you, we'll say a good like 10 minutes. I'm going to share this resource with you. And from there, I'm going to give you a chance to process, plot this out. But before we go there, I'm curious to know, what questions do you have about how you might use this document, or how I'm going to encourage you to use this document? So I'm going to open it up for a minute. Very soon, I'm going to set you loose to use this document to plan some quadrant 2. Before that, though, what questions do you have? As you're potentially plotting out any questions you might have, I'm going to start dropping this document in various forms.
I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, using this myself or sharing this with teachers. Is this something that you kind of do and then you're just kind of flexible in your head about how, weeks are different.
Yeah. So what I have done with teachers I've coached in the past, and when using it myself, is there are some that I'm going to try to make sure that those stay pretty consistent. And then I might build in some buffers. So sometimes it's helpful to almost like overplan. So let's say, for example, that I really only want to spend like 3 hours of grading every week. Like that in this category up here is like my main goal. Here, I'll show you. So if up here, I only want to spend 3 hours, I'm also going to be really realistic that my week is going to flex quite a lot. So maybe I dedicate a specific hour every day throughout the week to grading, knowing that I'm going to have some buffer, that if something comes up on Tuesday, I still have 3 more hour chunks remaining for the rest of my week. I would try to look at it in terms of how to build in some of that flexibility, knowing that weeks can fluctuate, but as much as possible, trying to dedicate some of those time blocks. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. What other questions do you all have in the immediate? Feel free to unmute yourself, hop on, or jot in the chat. All right, on that note, what I've done is I've dropped in the PDF. So you're welcome to download the PDF. I've also dropped in a link to the Google Doc if you want to check that out. If you want to make a copy, feel free to make a copy, adjust it. So for example, you might put different things in those target blocks. If you're an administrator, you're probably not grading or doing those sorts of tasks, but what are kind of your main time chunks that you want to make sure are dedicated out? And again, the tip, over plan a little bit and know that it's going to fluctuate, but definitely try to make sure that these times have a designated space and place. And with that, I'm going to give about 10 minutes for people to do some processing, plotting it out. And then I'm going to be lingering here. So if anyone has questions, you can hop on. You can privately chat if you want to, or chat to the whole group, or unmute yourself. But for the next 10 minutes, I just want you to explore and start to plot out what's your ideal amount of time you want to work. Within that time, how much is flexible, and where can you schedule those in as tightly as possible? No worries, Linda. I got you covered. All right, in case you missed the link to the doc, it is there. Oh, let me put it again in the whole chat for everybody. Take about 4 more minutes to explore. If you gotten to the point where you've already plotted out where all these things are going to go, now's the time to start anticipating what are going to be the hurdles. So, what might get in the way, and how can you pre plan for that? If you know that people are likely to come into your office during a certain time, or if you have your door open, or if you know that students might barge in at a certain time, how do you make sure that that time either gets really protected, you have some strategy in advance, or you build in some buffer somewhere else within your schedule to make sure that gets done? Take about 1 more minute. All right, let's do a check in. All you beautiful people. Here's where I would love to go next. I would love to just kind of open it up for a moment. And if something stood out to you as you were looking through this document, feel free to share. Were there moments where you're like, oh man, I really have a lot more to do than I thought? Or did you have moments where you're like, this actually has helped me kind of plot out and plan my time a little bit? Or if there's a moment where you're like, oh, here's how I would tweak this to use with teachers or for myself. I would love to hear your thoughts. How is this going for you so far, considering how to plot out your week?
I think once I put it down on paper, I realized I probably have more time than I feel like I have.
Yeah, for sure. There's actually studies on what is called time scarcity versus time abundance. And what researchers have found is that people actually have more time than they think. But what happens is that the time we have gets broken up into these like little blocks. So like we have moments that's way more efficient where you can order your groceries ahead of time rather than shopping and going out to the store. But we have often fill or stuff those times with some of those quadrant three, quadrant four moments. So what you're experiencing, you are totally not alone. It is a pretty common experience that when you see it actually mapped out, we might realize, maybe I am getting sucked into some quadrants that I don't need to. So thanks for sharing your observations, Sarah.
I would agree with Sarah. Hi, Sarah. I'm back, everyone. I no, I just realized I should have plenty of time, but I don't know. I overwhelm myself with emails and trying to be too nice. Like I double check and I reread, and I don't want to. I want to make sure everything I send as an instructional coach. I don't want my
Yeah.
teachers to ever feel overwhelmed by me. So I'm super
Yes.
critical, and I spend too much time on my emails. But then it might help me in the long run too. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I feel that trickiness. The amount of times I've gone through an email where I'm like, ooh, that's too many exclamation points. Like I shouldn't have, I don't want them to think I'm overly excited or like I need to tweak this, add this. And then it's like, if I had sent this email out 10 minutes ago, it probably would have had the same impact and I would have had more time. It is the balance of how do I make sure that I'm doing quality work, but not sucking into the quantity of time that I have. So can totally relate to you on that one, Linda. Thank you for sharing.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, in the chat, Diane, it helped me to see that if I focus my plan period on what I actually have to do for me, I might get my stuff done. Instead, I realized that my plan period gets taken up with errands, photocopying, or stuff that I could do another time and use a whole block for my work, like emails and grading work. Our planning periods are the times that I think most we need to protect and create those boundaries, because those are the areas where we flex in the most. Because we're like, oh, I'll have another planning period tomorrow, or I've got an hour of planning. So maybe if I save, just give a little 30 minutes of my time. And then that's how it starts to get compromised and taken advantage of. So if there were areas to make sure we own and create boundaries for ourselves, I would say planning periods or when we know we have that designated time are really, really important. Any other thoughts or observations so far? Because we're going to dive into a few more strategies now that might help.
I was just going to say sometimes when I was a teacher, one of my issues was during planning period, I needed that break. I needed to talk to people or
Yeah.
just get out of my room. And so I I would save my work till the end of the day, which was
Mm,
not the best plan, but then no one was around to interrupt me. The students were gone and I could
right.
get things done. So I kind of used that hour as more of a social time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I know that that was always, I don't know, like you said, I like, you mentioned earlier that if a student came in, not my job. And that part seems kind of hard, but I like that you said, but here's some options and then you can come back later. And
Yeah.
I'm out of, 30 years, I wish I would have thought of that.
Yeah. Trust me, it's really hard to practice. Like it is a mindset, and especially if someone's like coming in real crisis, and we're like, no, I really have to tend to that. But I think having in our mindset of knowing like I am a better educator if I don't get exhausted with my workload. And so part of me being able to support my students, my staff, my colleagues is making sure that I'm efficient with that time. Now, one thing you brought up that I think is important to point out is, so let's say your planning period, you do need that social break. You do need to connect with people. What I would recommend is that if that is, we'll say, for example, that's like kind of quadrant 4 from a work standpoint, not urgent, not necessarily important for my work, but like I need it to not feel so exhausted. I would recommend planning at least a little chunk to do and then rewarding ourselves with that quadrant 4. So if I want to socialize on my planning, maybe I block out. I'm going to turn off my lights, shut my door, and I'm going to set a timer for literally 10 or 15 minutes. For 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to just respond to as many emails as I can. And then as soon as that timer goes off, cool. I might have more time later on for those emails, but I'm going to take a little break or I'm going to take the rest of that planning time and connect. So again, we can still have these moments where we're getting a little relaxation, we're connecting, but could we build it in as a reward of getting some other stuff done in quadrant 2 before it drifts into quadrant 1?
Like that.
Other thoughts? Anything else that came up for you all?
I really like that the first question is very variable and that as
Mm,
teachers we can choose, because I work with lots of different teachers. Some teachers have some very personal boundaries where they really work their contractual time and they are
yeah,
super efficient. They don't go to the lunchroom, like that's their goal. I have
yeah,
other teachers who are okay spending all Sunday working. And I think
right.
sometimes as teachers, we think one is better than the other, or teachers will think, oh, I'm a bad teacher because I don't stay after
Mm,
school, or I work too much. But I like that it starts off with what I want to do and then
yeah.
work backwards from there. So I like that.
Yeah, that autonomy piece of, as much as possible, like I want to own what my job looks like. It's something called job crafting that engaged workers, they do this. They think ahead of time of like, what do I want my job to look like? And then how do I redesign or engage things to make that happen? And like you said, for some people, they get so much fulfillment out of doing certain things with their jobs that like maybe they want to put the extra time into planning out an awesome lesson. And that might require them to be there on Sundays, but it's fulfilling to them. For other people, they might shift and say, you know what, I'm still going to find fulfillment in my work, but my family is really important to me. So in order to stay balanced in my life, like I'm going to dedicate my time differently. That is really important to know that everyone's desired work week is going to look slightly different. And so how do we empower people to take control and ownership of that? Great thought again. Okay, so here's where we're going to shift to. We're going to look at a couple other strategies. And so again, I'm going to look a lot through the lens of as educators, teachers, what are some of the strategies that can help, but then we'll also look at what could this look like for a non-teaching role as well. Here's a key insight. This is one of my favorite quotes in talking about how to improve. It comes from James Clear, who has a lot of great quotes, that you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Take a moment to just process that. Consider getting it tattooed on your arm or something. I don't know. That's a really important quote, because I think what happens is that we set this goal of like, yeah, I want to only work 40 hours, or I only want to put in a certain amount of time. But that goal is useless without a system or set of strategies to support it. So we also have to look at how are we becoming efficient within our systems. So looking back at our big four, we're going to kind of group some of these together and look at, so what are the ways that we can reduce our feedback and grading? What are some ways that we can reduce our communication or reduce the time we put into lesson planning? Starting with feedback and grading. I'm going to share some insights, not only from that UK study that actually tested out some of these strategies, but also both as a teacher and as a coach, what I've seen other teachers do and I've done within my own world to be more efficient. What you'll notice with ways to become more efficient in feedback and grading is that a lot of these on the surface seem like the old school strategies that like teachers used to use a long time ago that we have scoffed at for a long time. For example, giving whole class feedback. So let's say kids are working on a worksheet and they work on that worksheet. Sometimes teachers feel like they have to have that submitted to them and then they have to go through every single one and give individualized feedback for every kid. When what has been found is that in a lot of, especially those lower Bloom's taxonomy tasks, just giving students feedback in the moment whole class is just as effective. So rather than having them all submitted in, they're just going to hold on to their paper and I'm going to give them the answers and they're going to go through and kind of self-correct. Or similarly, their peers, so they're going to trade papers with someone else and they're going to check each other's work. I want to point out that another mindset shift that I think is really important for educators is not everything needs to be a grade. But if it's worth doing, it's worth getting feedback on and delineating that of not everything has to be like a point system that then I have to now enter into a grade book. Otherwise kids are never going to do it or it's not useful. Like some things it's okay just to do to practice learning as long as we're trying to provide some feedback. So ways we can do that is through whole class feedback or having peers check. A similar system is self-checks. So one of the most efficient teachers I have seen or coached within my career, what she would do is she would have students do a worksheet or some task, and then she would have a model example up by her desk. So like if it was a worksheet, it was the worksheet filled out, showing the evidence, a couple notes. And so students would work on that independently. And then when they were ready or when they were done trying out something, they would just come up and they would check their work. And then she would make herself available so that if they wanted to ask questions, she didn't have to monitor around. They would come to her. And if they weren't coming up at the time, she could be plugging away at some other work or conferencing with students. And it was a really small but easy system of students are still getting feedback. The teacher's still making sure that feedback is solid and providing some different time structure so that they're getting it in the moment. So how can we provide self-checks? Does the technology we use have that built in, and how do we leverage that and take advantage of that? Similarly, conferencing. So how do I give in-person feedback as much as possible so so I don't have to take things home. This, for me as an English teacher, was a game changer. I used to spend hours sitting down, jotting down feedback on essays to my students, and I would hand them back to them, and they would just flip to the grade and dump it in the bin, and it used to frustrate me to no end. And so I realized like the written feedback isn't effective. They're not even reading it. So how do I shift that? And then what I started doing is, as they're drafting their essays, I would pull them aside either one-on-one or in groups and give them feedback in the moment. I made sure every single student got an in-person feedback during class time. Not only did it cut down immensely on the feedback I was giving when they turn in their essays, but the quality of their work was so much better. They were getting feedback while they're doing it rather than waiting until afterwards. And so this is a system change that can reduce some of that time. How are we implementing conferencing as much as possible? Relatedly, sometimes we give too much feedback. Sometimes we want to give them feedback on all the things rather than prioritizing the most important things. So another thing that I shifted to is, even though I wanted to give them feedback on every grammatical mistake they made on their essays or every terrible transition, I limited myself to say, if there were just 2 things they could do differently that would instantly improve their writing, what would those 2 things be? Again, why do we overwhelm people with a whole dense amount of information? Probably because it makes us feel like we're effective, when the reality is the more concise, the more condensed, the more actionable that feedback is. So how do we really limit the amount of feedback or grading we do? And then last kind of category in here is rubrics. The more we can reuse rubrics for different tasks, the better. So what would it look like, for example, if I know my students are going to be doing quite a lot of tasks where they're analyzing something? How do I create a pretty broad rubric for various analytical tasks, but maybe there's a spot within that rubric that I can personalize for this specific assignment? Now, this does 2 things. Number 1, it saves us from having to create a whole bunch of different rubrics. Number 2, it allows students to have some familiarity or consistency with that rubric. If our rubrics are designed well, it gives them information and feedback where we're just like circling a box or noting something rather than having to write out or break down all these little details. This is another area that saved my world as an English teacher. So how do I create writing rubrics that I know I'm going to reuse, that students can reference and look at, and it saves time? So ponder those for a little bit. What are you thinking about? What would this look like for you? And as you're plotting, trying to think of, okay, where could I build this system in? And I'm going to tell you, please don't try to do all these things. Do not overwhelm yourself of like, I'm going to change everything. Like, choose one of them that you want to experiment with, master, or coach a teacher on how to use before trying to overwhelm with all of them. Take a few moments to just ponder that. With that, now we're going to shift into lesson planning. Now, lesson planning is a little tricky. Sometimes with lesson planning, some of us really want a lot of details. For some of us, we don't need a lot of details. For some of us, we have like kind of already set out scripted lesson planning. But here's a couple things that have been found to be really, really helpful with reducing those workloads. Number 1, the use of just a very basic template that I'm going to reuse all the time. Maybe, for example, I'm just going to make sure I have plotted out what is going to be my bell ringer before a lesson starts, or what is going to be the main assessment, or what is the read aloud that we're going to do during this day. And I'm just going to plot that out. What we know is that sometimes teachers put way too much detail into it. Like, we spend all this time trying to make sure that it looks fancy on the template when really we only need like a couple little prompts for our memory of what we're going to do, or a couple little visuals of how it's going to sequence together. So how can we use templates? I'm also a big proponent of trying to use digital support for this. So I know some people really like the written out, I'm going to plan out my lessons, but here's one advantage of if you put this on a Google Doc, for example. It allows you so that if you are home and you're planning out some of that time, you don't have to worry about bringing documents with you back and forth, so that you can access that from anywhere if you need to. Secondly, it's something that you can revisit over and over. So if I do have to teach the same content again next year, if I've already mapped that out visually, I have some of that pre-planning done. So I'm a big fan of whatever template we use. A, simplify. B, if we can digitize it, it can save us in the long run. Co-planning is another strategy that has found to be really effective. Sometimes this looks like divide and conquer. So if I know that I'm going to be teaching the same content as someone else, could we break it up? Like, okay, if you could find a read aloud, or if you could find the support video, or if you could come up with a quick bell ringer or formative assessment, I'll work on another element of this. If we can create those designated times. So maybe you try to dedicate, hey, every Monday, I'm going to make sure that during my planning period, I'm going to sit down with a colleague and start to map and plan out some things. Co-planning can be really effective. Another side strategy that I've seen some teachers talk about positively is, rather than planning Monday to Friday, planning out their Tuesday to Monday. And here's why. Some teachers do this because they know if they don't have Monday pre-planned on the weekend, they're going to spend their entire Sunday trying to plot that out. So what they do is they shift it and they make sure that they have Monday already pre-planned and they had planned it out the week ahead of time. So that way Sundays can be their protected time with their family, or they have to do very minimal for planning it out. We'd see a lot of Monday to Fridays, but what would it look like to shift that from Tuesday, planning it out, until the next Monday? Couple thoughts on that one. Again, I want to give you a chance to process. If you want to jot down some notes for yourself, or if you want to drop into the chat or unmute and let us know. What are you thinking right now?
I love the Tuesday to Monday idea, because I've always said, like, I would do my job for free, but I'd want 3-day weekends because Sunday
Right.
evenings, like, it does just feel like everything's like hanging over me. And
Yeah.
so I just love the idea. And I think teachers would really appreciate that idea that Sunday they could like let it go because they knew it was planned. So I love
Yeah.
that idea.
The Sunday blues, we've all had them before we get them. You know, it's like, not only do I have to shift from having weekend free time to work time, it's like, oh, I have to really plan everything out for tomorrow. Also, I'm a big fan of having your week start off as smooth as possible. So if I have that plan ahead of time, you know, maybe I need to tinker a little bit, but like, I know that my Monday is going to be solid, good to go. I can focus on my students and connecting, and then that sets a good tone for the rest of the week. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Other thoughts? What's coming out to you right now? All right, next category we're going to look at then. We're going to look at one more category, then we're going to open it up for a little bit more processing time, connection time, and then I'm going to make myself available for any sort of Q&A if people want to brainstorm for themselves or for supporting others. Let's talk about communication. I'm going to talk specifically about parent communication, although a lot of other communication can come into play. We get so many friggin' emails. I mean, the amount of emails that come in are a major suck of those quadrants. So sometimes they're quadrant 3, sometimes they're quadrant 1. We have to respond to them immediately, but very rarely are they actual quadrant 2 ones. A lot of times they're a distraction. So here's some helpful tips, especially for communicating with parents. Number one, I'm going to go back to the idea of templates. So if we know we're going to have pretty consistent responses around things, what would it look like if on a separate Google document, I have pre-typed out most of what that will say? So if I know that every week I'm going to send out a positive note to parents about their students, like, can I pre-type out a script for that first and then copy and paste it into my email, change a couple details, and then I'm good to go? Or if I know that I have very common parent emails around a student subject area, so maybe I've been doing this for a little while and I know that students struggle with a specific literacy skill, and I know that there are some resources that could help the parents, help the student. Maybe I have that set up as a template, and then again, I just copy and paste it over into an email document, change a couple details. Most of the body of my email is already submitted and sent. Templates can be really, really effective. Businesses use this to be more efficient all the time. I think it's time that education and educators give themselves permission as well. Another strategy is the 1-minute email. So here's what this looks like. I'm going to set a timer of emailing a parent or a colleague If I can't finish what I need to say in 1 minute, maybe I shift that to a phone conversation instead. So oftentimes what I would do is I would set a timer a minute, start to write it out. If it was good to go and that's information I send out. If it looked like it'd be more time, I would adjust my email and say, hey, I have time tomorrow during 2:30 to 3 o'clock. I'm wondering if I can call you during that time. And that's the email I would send out. And then literally what I would do is after school, as I'm talking to a parent on the phone, I would walk around my classroom tidying things up. So it was like killing two birds with one stone. I'm trying to be efficient with something, making sure things are organized, but I'm also having some communication as well. There's also this idea that if we set the boundary, it forces us to be concise and precise. So if I can't say what I need to say in 1 minute, either A, I need to shift to being more precise with my communication, or B, again, maybe the email isn't the best source of this because there's way more lack of clarity the longer the email goes. So how do I be consistent and concise? Similarly, kind of tying that in, designated parent communication time. Again, maybe I'm looking at that resource I shared with you all earlier, and I'm going to block out my mornings. I'm going to dedicate 15 minutes every morning to doing parent communication. Or I know I'm going to block out at the end of school 30 minutes, and that's where my parent communication is going to happen, whether it's responding to emails or making phone calls. And then I know that that time is designated to communication, and I don't let other things start to bleed in. I try to make sure that that is accomplished. So designating our specific time for the types of communication that we may need to do are some of the strategies that can be helpful with communication. Let's check in. In addition to processing your own thoughts, I would love this next little chunk of time to be sharing with each other. So like, what has worked for you in reducing this time? If you have links, if you have ideas, if you have stuff you've seen other educators do, now's the time where we get to share collaboratively. So I'm gonna stop talking and open the floor to you all. Either what's processing right now in your head, or what strategies have you seen be effective in these ideas of saving time or setting up systems?
So I
Okay.
think,
Oh,
oops, go ahead,
no,
Lynn.
Diane, no, go ahead. I've already talked enough.
Oh, no, you haven't. I want more. I want more. With me, one of the things that I've done is the templates, because I am uploading. Basically, if you picture a television studio, I'm running it and I'm teaching the kids how to run it. So they're doing projects that are in front of a camera. And so we made a YouTube channel, and I spend a lot of time uploading kids' projects. So I've made templates that say, hey, I've uploaded your project. It's public or it's private. And, here's the link to it, so that I can just use those templates in the email and then throw it out to, the parent and the student at the same time, with the link to their work. That
That's a good
saved a
idea.
ton. I have not used it, but I guess I should start, because that's one thing they're harping on is I need more parent communication. Like, just to say your kid is awesome, I love having them in class type of email. So I think I'll work on that with templates as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that even just like making those little habits of like once a day, I'm going to send out a parent communication. Like even if it is just like a quick email of a kid I'm thinking of, that starts to build that habit. We start to develop some new templates of like, hey, I seem to be saying the same thing quite a lot, so I'm going to create this as a template. But the thing that you brought up that I think is really interesting is that if we have templates, that does kind of create a clarity or consistency of communication, that what I'm sharing with students, I can also share directly with parents as well. Like it's not a matter of misinterpreting, like they're both seeing the exact same communication, same templates, students class to class or year to year, also seeing similar things as well. That's another great insight.
I have a really great app that I want to share, but I can't think of the name of it. So I was just looking for it. I'll think of it before we hang up. I'm from 1980. Okay, so this app is for communication with parents, and you put in their cell phone number, and everything goes through your it goes through your computer. So you're never using your phone, but you can type out a message. Gosh, I can't remember the name of it.
Is it Remind?
Nope. It's better than Remind, but
And we
sorry,
had one
I
we
stepped
used
on
during
any
the
toes.
pandemic, and I can't think what it was called either.
Shoot. Anyway, so it translates into any language that's being spoken at home, and you type in your message, you send it, and then it comes right back to you that the message was received. And then when parents get it, they get it on their cell phone, and then they can respond to it, and you get it back on your email. And so you're never like in your phone and doing anything like that. It's all, and it's, Diane, it might be good for you too, because you could send out your templates, you could send out messages, and then you have data that shows that you have been sending out messages, and they even have graphics, infographics that show like how many parents have responded and have read and have, replied. So it's pretty cool. I'll think of it before we end.
Is it talking points?
Yes.
You shared it with me. I've never used it, but you did share it with me.
Yeah, it is so good. Was that it, Carrie, that you were thinking of, talking points?
I'm
I'm
sorry.
gonna I'm gonna jot that one down.
Yeah, talking
no,
points.
I don't think I've heard of that one. Sounds
It
interesting. Though.
is. It's amazing. And you can upload your classes. And if you have a great IT person, they can come in and help you. If it's not that easy for you, they can come in and help you just upload all your information right off like whatever system that your school's using. So it's really cool, and it's a great way to communicate, not to take away from talking, but parents have their cell phones on them all the time,
Yep.
at least according to the kids.
Yeah.
I was talking to my mom.
Yep.
Right?
Well, while you're talking to your mom, can you ask if she got my message?
Right.
Exactly. So,
Well, I also,
Do you know if there's a cost to that, Linda?
absolutely free.
Wow.
awesome.
Mhm.
I mean, that idea of having a boundary of even how we're accessing communication is also really important. For some people, like this instantly becomes like a quadrant 3, quadrant 4, quadrant 1 sort of moment where like I'm constantly checking it. I know some people are like hardcore. They don't put work email on their phones. Other people, for myself, I liked having it on there, but then I made designated times when I would check it. So like I liked knowing the night before if an email was popping in, so I didn't look at it first thing Monday morning and start freaking out. But I, again, designated the time that I would actually look at it versus responding to everything. Or I made sure there weren't actual push notifications lighting my phone up, that it would be something I'd have to check through. So again, knowing our
That's one
boundaries.
thing I think I found too, when if I took a day off, I would take the notifications, I would turn that off, because as soon as that number popped up there, I was ready to go do it. But if the number wasn't there, I was less likely to be pulled to it.
Yeah.
It's almost like you were at work anyway, if you didn't.
Yeah.
I'm homesick, I'm constantly trying to keep up, and I should have just went to work.
Right. Save the sick day.
Yeah, exactly.
Love these shares. What else has worked for you all, or have you seen work? Or is there something you want to like problem solve or fine tune around right now?
I think the thing that I like about this is I have a lot of I have a lot of teachers that I work with that just, of course, we're doing your book study, The Burnout Cure, and we're doing that. We're doing, there you go. And we're doing a lot of cool activities and challenges with that. But then for the people that have already done it, but are still kind of sucked into it's a little different than burnout. It's almost like, it's like post-pandemic burnout. It's like my administration is saying that we're going to do things a little bit simpler and just take a deep breath, but here's 7,000 things that you need to do,
Yeah.
And I know that the world doesn't stop. I just trying to help my teachers find a balance and do the best they can. And I like at the beginning when you just said, give yourself permission, like it's going to be okay. And it takes almost everything out of me not to say like, there's a teacher shortage. Just do your best. Just do your best. And, if you're doing what's right for kids, you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that they, like do anything terrible or like neglect any of their major responsibilities. But at the same time, I don't know, people just need a breath. Summer wasn't enough. Summer, I think for some teachers felt like Thanksgiving break, like,
Right.
so, and even like the kids' behaviors are
Yeah.
stressful. Just because the few years that they would have had the practice of, like, a fourth and fifth grader would have had the practice of communicating with their teacher and their classmates and learning like those nuances of what not to do. They missed those, and now they're doing them as sixth and seventh graders. And
Yeah.
the junior high teachers are like, I'm used to junior high behavior, but what is this? And it's kind of hitting everywhere. So I just see it everywhere. It's crazy. So trying to figure out how I can use these things, this advice, and to try to tie it in with some of my teachers that are literally coming to me like I'm their counselor.
Oh, right. Yeah. I think I mean,
Yeah.
when I was coaching the past 3 years, it was like 20% talking instruction, 80% like processing life. Like, how do you cope and how do you
Yes.
deal? Kind of on that note, I didn't really mention the reason I refer to this document as a pretest is here's what I would love for you to do as your homework assignment is you've plotted this out. And now what I would love for you to do is over the next week, kind of track how well do you hit this target versus where are the moments where it falls flat or you get sucked into things. Because what this ultimately is a way of kind of processing and tinkering. So if my goal is maybe I only want to work 50 hours a week and I want to have these designated times, but then over the next week I realize, hey, I really get all my time sucked up during my planning, that's information. And that gives us something that we can move forward with. On the coaching front, what's really interesting is to sit down with someone you're coaching or working with, have them fill out like their ideal desired, like what would you like it to look like? And then either sit down with them later or have them work through what does it actually look like? And now as a coach, I can do a little comparison and see like, oh, my teacher really wants to free up on making sure that they have plenty of time for grading and feedback, but they only want to spend like 4 hours of grading feedback time. But now I'm realizing they're actually spending 10 hours a week doing grading feedback. Ooh, that's a place where I can teach them a strategy to be way more efficient with their grading and feedback. Or maybe their intended target is 5 hours a week of lesson planning, but they're telling me that they're coming in on Sunday for hours and hours in lesson planning. Okay, now we have a goal that we can work towards of how do we get more efficient with our lesson planning time? So just jotting it down as a goal is like step one. Step two is now do I compare it to reality and where do I start to strategize my systems? So I think that also can be really empowering for educators of like, okay, I hear you. I hear you are so stressed with your workload right now. I want to make sure that I give you some strategies. So like, here's what it's going to look like. And then people know, oh, I actually can control this. I don't have to grade every essay. I don't have to spend 10 hours extra a week doing these things. So think of it as a coaching tool as well of what's my goal, what's reality, and then where do the systems need to support. All right, we have about 10 more minutes. And so a couple things, obviously we can continue to strategize, but the main thing I want you to process in these next 10 minutes is what is one thing that you want to do differently moving forward? Like we talked about a lot of things. And again, educators get sucked into, I want to do all the things, but we know that we should probably prioritize. So for example, maybe you are looking at this document and you're like, this is the one thing is I'm going to jot down my intended target. I'm going to reflect on it later. Boom. Or maybe you're looking at some of these strategies and you're like, you know what? I want to implement some peer checks. That's the one thing I want to try and impact. So that is at least your targeted question to close things out, your exit ticket, if you will, your exit slip.
So I have one that I kind of want to do personally and then one as a coach.
Okay.
As a coach, there are several, as I'm thinking about the group of teachers I work with, there are several that over like every week, I can tell they're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And so I would like to kind of make a copy of this template in my drive and maybe even make a paper copy, because I, like Linda, am also from 1980, but just to kind of pull out, because sometimes it's nicer to have just the paper and just kind of talk about it with some of those teachers and be intentional about that as we're looking at new goal cycles. I think that'd be a really good place to go. And then that affects the instruction. I think sometimes we think, okay, what's the instructional goal that we can work on? But if these things aren't in place, it's hard to effectively do that. So professionally, that's what I'd like to do. And then for my own self, I did not nearly get finished filling out that whole form. Like, it took me a while just to kind of look through my schedule and say, okay, how many hours am I really in meetings? And, you know, and how many of those hours do I really work? And so I'd like to just kind of go back, and I love planning PD, but I always end up doing it at the very last minute. Because I'm answering emails all day long or looking at my phone. I mean, sometimes, but I always think like, oh, I really want to plan that PD, but it gets pushed. And so allotting a certain amount of time each week, I don't know when that'll be, or if it'll be a little bit each day to really do that. I'll really enjoy that. And I won't feel like it's hanging over me. And then, oh my gosh, I've got to plan this whole PD at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Love it. Thank you for sharing a couple examples of helping others and helping ourselves.
I realize that I have to put the phone away or lock it in the cabinet or something. Mostly because I found that I'm addicted to several games on it. So if I start that at lunchtime, and then my plan period is literally right after lunch, that I'm still sitting in the lunchroom playing a game. So I need to put the phone away, or just do a quick check on it, or lock it in a cabinet, or do something till after plan period. And then, you know, quick check it in between classes or something where I don't have the time to sit there and go, oh, I can play.
Right. Yeah. Because I think games, social media, like, they are designed to bring us back and back. Like, they are designed like casinos to get us hooked and coming back. So, like, just as we would, you know, make some choices to avoid the casino every day, how are we also avoiding our pocket casinos that we have running with us? I think that, again, I can relate to so much of having to know when to set those boundaries, because I start to feel myself sucked into those. Thanks for sharing. We got about 5 minutes left. Anything else for the good of the order? Goals you want to set for yourself, or insights you've had, or questions you have?
I hesitated to sign up to do this because I didn't feel like I had time. Seriously. And I just had my first evaluation today, and I'm not even ready for tomorrow. So, but this was well worth the time. I need to sit down and do the pre-test and really see where I have time that I can focus on the specific things that I need to done and get more done during the time that I have. And I think that template will help. And then doing some more, I do have kids do self-check. It works pretty well, kind of holds them more accountable for their own learning. And they don't read the things you write on their papers, whether it's electronic or, you know, paper. So this was well worth the time.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Carrie and I were actually talking before this of, like, probably the people who really need this are the people who haven't managed their time enough to be here. But I mean, I think it is saying something that even for you all, knowing that, like, time is finite and scarce, like, still dedicating that time. How do I take care of myself, plot out my own needs, and try to develop some strategies is huge for the long-term haul that this thing of education is. So shout out and cheers. I'm glad it had some value for you.
One thing that I wanted to share too is I think when you have something set up at night. So if I think back to teaching, I had 3 boys back to back to back. They were in sports. We were never home. I just went from running around with them and then back home. and then, put your head on the pillow, wake up 5 seconds later and back at work. And so, and I love that life. It was great. And, it was tough, but it was wonderful. But now that I have a little bit more control over my social life and what I can do in the evenings, I have started to plan a few things with friends or just planning on watching a movie or doing something just for me. And I think being more mindful in the morning of what my end game is, what helps me obviously a lot better get some of these things done, where before I might just procrastinate because I planned on probably just doing it at home anyway. Like I didn't make time for myself. So I think using your sheet and then thinking like, what is the one thing I want to do when I get home today? Like, do I want to feel overwhelmed with the things I didn't get done? Or do I want to feel great and just enjoy the night and enjoy whatever I have planned? So that's been somewhere along the line. I think that's kind of a combination of something that I'm working on always and falling back into, but what I want to focus on. So
I love that. I love that. And I'll kind of close out with, because that really segues to this idea of, I think within all of this talk about managing our time, we also have to practice self-forgiveness, because, we're not weak as people just because we allow quadrant 3, quadrant 4 things to happen. We shouldn't be down on ourselves because we've mapped out what our ideal week looks like, and then next week it's a hot mess and nothing like that. I think sometimes we just have to forgive and say, I tried my best, I'm learning, I'm going to learn from that mistake, I'm going to try to tweak things. It's really, really important for our well-being as well, to know that we're going to try new strategies. If it doesn't work out, that doesn't mean everything is ruined. How do we forgive ourselves moving forward? So as we close this out, I hope that you grab a couple things. I hope that you use this template to the best of your desire. And if there's anything else I can do to support you along the way, please reach out. I am going to drop my email into the chat right now so that, I don't know what just happened there. Somehow I escaped. Where did I go? I don't know why I look like that, but there it is. Speaking of technology, so I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. Please feel free to email. I'm kind of liking this right now. Ooh, I found a whole bunch of stuff. Look at that. Look at that. How do I make it stop? Okay, now so my email's there. Feel free to reach out between now and whenever, or now and the next time we get a chance to connect. If you want to brainstorm, if you're working with a teacher and want to pitch some ideas, this is what I do, is supporting you all to be at your best so you can give your best to those who need you. With that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights in your conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next session with you all, if you're coming along. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the boss sauce. Carrie, what you got?
Thank you very much for that. It was very good. That was very good. And I can totally see how, as an instructional coach, like you guys probably thinking of how you can use that stuff for yourself, but then also how applicable it is the next time you sit down with a teacher. And Angie, you too, for your teachers. Chase will be back with us next month, and it's on being grateful, I believe. That kind of goes along with the Thanksgiving November kind of thing. So it's November 17th, and I'll be sending out information about that probably early next week. I'll send out a flyer, and you're welcome to share with anybody, forward to any educators you know that you think would be interested in joining, and I'll make sure you have the link to registration. I will take attendance, and then you should get an email for your the survey part. And then once you complete that and submit it, then you get your evidence of completion for your PDHs for the session. All right. Thanks, Chase.
Hey, thank you all. It was fun.
Yeah, it was good. It was very good. So you all have a great evening.
Okay. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Chase.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.